Thank you, everybody. So my name is Rachel Fee. Today I'm going to talk about learning by teaching, and this year I took up my first job as a professor at Fanshawe College. It's just a part-time job for me. I graduated from Fanshawe College as well. My full-time job, I'm a developer and support lead at Resolution Interactive Media in London, Ontario. So teaching isn't really something that I ever really specifically thought that I was going to get into. My family had always kind of thought I'd be a great teacher, and I never really thought it was something that I would do. And one day I'm at work and I get an email from my professor. I'd kept relationships with all of them. And he told me that there was a job available teaching lamp stack. I kind of laughed at it and I was like, well, this is not really something that is for me, you know. I don't know all of these topics in depth. I'm not an expert at any of these things. But I was kind of interested, and I told my coworkers about it, and they all encouraged me to look into it a little bit further. So I emailed back, and I talked to him about some of the requirements for the job, and he said, you'll be great, you'll be fine, you can learn this stuff, anything that you don't know, you'll be fine, you have the experience. So I said, okay, fine, I'll do it. It was absolutely terrifying for me because I never saw myself as a teacher. I'm not a speaker whatsoever, despite the fact that I'm speaking today. So I was trained as a developer, more in the systems development kind of area, so C++, Java, C#. I never had a lot of practical experience in that department. I went into web development after I graduated, so mainly working with PHP, a lot of ASP, occasional other side projects like Android, a little bit of PLC interfacing, and some legacy projects along the way, so a little bit of everything. But mainly I work in PHP. So in addition to doing client work for an agency, my personal job is client support, so I interact with clients and provide updates to either existing projects or new features. I've also done some writing and some research along the way, but this teaching thing is new to me in the last year. So after a variety of experience and different types of development work, I went into teaching. So today we're going to talk a little bit about different approaches as far as learning when you're a new developer and an experienced developer. We're going to talk about some of the different learning styles and how to be adaptable. We're going to talk about how to avoid making bad habits for new developers. Everybody's had the new kid on their team that is doing something completely crazy that you want to avoid. And we're going to talk about what you can learn yourself by teaching new developers, which is maybe not something that is an expectation going into the job. So I kind of talked about this. I never saw myself as a teacher, but once I was convinced to kind of take the job, I started to see some of the opportunities that I had ahead. It's an opportunity for growth. It's a great speaking experience, and that's not just speaking in this sort of format, but to clients. There's always a time when you need to talk to clients or bosses or anything like that. Any speaking experience you can get is great. And it's also something to put on your resume. I mean, it's maybe a little bit petty, but having I was a professor on your resume looks great on a job application. So going into the future, any experience you have like that is great. Once I started teaching, I realized that that maybe wasn't all of the reasons I had to teach. It taught me my own craft a lot more thoroughly than what I had initially going into it. And it was also a little bit selfish because it let me teach the new generation what I wanted them to know. In my industry, specifically the type of development that I do, there's a lot of developers out there. There's not a lot of good developers. It's quite a big competition to get the good developers. Everybody's fighting over them, and it can be tough to find good talent. So getting in the door early and talking to developers before they get out onto the job market lets us show them the right skills that they need to benefit us in the future, which is selfish, but it lets us reinforce best practices so that later they know what they need to do and what we expect of them. And it's a great networking opportunity as well, because you don't know where people are going to end up in the future. Having a good network of great developers really benefits you in the future. And plus, if you need a new coworker, you have already a selection of people who maybe don't have jobs that you can look towards. It also taught me a lot of soft skills that I didn't really expect. I knew it was going to be a big time commitment, but I didn't realize the skills that I would learn as far as organization and time management. To some degree, your job does teach you this, but throwing in teaching on top of that, it's more self-led, so you have a lot of different tasks that you have to fill in, and you kind of have an unspecified amount of time to do it. It also taught me a lot of confidence as far as my job itself. So I found a lot of times when I went into meetings and I was explaining my reasoning for things, I maybe wasn't so confident about what I was talking about. Especially being younger, I felt a lot of times like I was maybe being judged by older developers, and they would think I didn't know what I was talking about. So I found that teaching gave me a lot of confidence to feel that I actually knew what I was talking about when I went into a meeting or to speak with a potential client or anything like that. All right, so I got the job. I didn't have a whole lot of time to get ready for it, but I went in there and I taught my first class, and it was absolutely terrifying. I almost cried most of my way through my first lecture I ever did. I stumbled all over the place, kind of like I'm doing today. I had no idea what I was talking about for most of the time. Through the semester, I made a lot more mistakes. It was by no means perfect, and it was a very big learning experience for me. It was really difficult to see kids struggling, kids not understanding what you're talking about. There's only so much you can do to teach them what you're trying to get across. So I made a lot of mistakes as far as how I approach teaching itself. But to my surprise, I was offered another contract to come back and teach again. So I guess maybe it didn't go that bad. But facing that again and all the challenges that I had as far as having people understand, again, was probably even more terrifying. But along the way, I learned a lot of things, and I had a lot of new ideas, and I knew that I could make it better the next time. And I knew what I was going to change to help people understand better and learn better from what I did the first time. So I went back in and took on another contract. And it was exciting, but it was also pretty terrifying at the same time. So the first time around, my biggest issue with my class was my own fault. And it was not setting clear expectations. This is something that can affect you whether you're teaching, whether you're a student, whether you're a client, or whether you're a developer. So if you just assume that you're going to get what you want, you're probably not going to get what you want. Everybody's going to have a very different idea of what a product looks like. So take a to-do list, for example. If I tell you that I want you to build me an app, that's a simple to-do list. Everybody in this room is going to have a very different understanding of what that app is going to look like. There's the ability to add a task, edit a task, delete a task. That stuff can be assumed. But not everybody is going to have those same assumptions. And what your to-do list looks like is going to be very different than what mine looks like. So by setting clear expectations, we can close up loopholes. And we can use those expectations, if they're well written, as a development guide. So probably when a lot of us learned to develop, we looked at pseudocode, which is writing out basically your plan for what you're going to do before you actually write your code. So writing out expectations, not even as a client, but as a developer, lets you kind of plan out your app more specifically so that you can attack it already knowing what you're going to do. It lets you narrow down the structure of your application. So depending on a to-do list app, if you know that all you need to do is add a task and edit a task and delete a task, you're going to write the app very differently than what you're going to do if you are creating a full calendar application with syncing and Evernote and all kinds of crazy stuff. So consider something like a format. Say this to-do list needs phone numbers for meetings. You can specify as a developer that input box is going to take in 10 digits. They're only going to be numbers. It's just going to be a simple 10-digit number, no fancy formatting, no brackets or anything. As a developer, you already know your data type, your input type, what type of validation you're going to provide. You don't need to code more than that. You don't need to worry about validating letters or brackets or anything like that. As a student, getting expectations like that gives a hint as to where to start writing code. If I tell somebody to write an input box that validates a phone number, there's 100 different ways to write that, using regex, using different formats, using different types of inputs. So setting clear expectations for students gives them a huge number of hints as to how they can actually complete the work itself. So that includes things like how your app's going to be laid out, what it's actually going to look like, its functionality, how the data will be stored. Maybe it'll be stored in a database. Maybe it'll be stored somewhere else. And based on those answers, everybody's app is going to look extremely different. So it taught me not only to be specific to my students, but how to be specific as a developer. It taught me that when I explain to clients what I'm going to provide to them, that I'm specific so that they don't expect a formatted phone number or a calendar when I've only had in mind a simple record list. So as developers, we all have our ideal way that we're going to write that list. We all have things that we want to try and our best practices that we usually follow and our standard formats and our little rules that we've made up for ourselves. But a new developer doesn't have those rules that they've figured out. They're completely going out into the wide open internet to try and figure this out. So code is a very creative thing for a lot of people. There's a lot of different ways to solve problems, and while it's structured, you can go about those structures in different ways. And as we learn more, we learn that there are more options, and we want the ability to use those options in the best way possible. So we all want the ability to own our project. The greatest thing ever is if you can get a project and make it your own and see it through to the end. But that doesn't give a new developer any guidelines as to what they need to do. So while we might have an ideal way that we want to complete a project and we can get all excited about owning it and doing something really cool, that just overwhelms a new developer. So they don't have that basis to make an informed choice about how they're going to go ahead and complete the app. So my first semester, Another mistake that I made, outside of setting clear expectations for what I wanted out of apps, was that I gave a whole lot of freedom to my students. So if I told them to make a to-do app, I gave them very basic goals that they had. Store some to-dos and print them out and, be able to sort them, or, some sort of vague guidelines like that. And I gave them the ability to complete that task in any way that they wanted, with any structure that they wanted. And it didn't go well. I found that a whole lot of people were getting lost. They were confused. I was constantly getting messages as to what the expectations were. And people just didn't understand that when I say, you have some freedom here, that they could go ahead and, make it their own and do whatever they want. But that's overwhelming to a new developer because they don't have that knowledge to know how to keep it reasonable without making it too complicated. They don't know the best ways to proceed. So by offering that freedom to people, I ended up getting a whole lot of cheating in my program. A lot of cheating. It's very difficult in development because a school such as Fanshawe sets out specific guidelines to cheating. You can't copy from the internet. You can't copy from another student. You can't reuse work. You can't, copy something out of a textbook. And that's great if you're writing an essay. But in development, there's only a certain number of ways to do different things. And some things are very standard, such as, if you're going to format a phone number, you're always going to format a phone number in the same way, using the same code. So where does that end? It's very hard to set expectations as far as what's considered cheating and what's considered copying and what isn't. So I might say, it's fine if you copy a function to format a phone number because there's a limited number of ways to format a phone number. But you can't format you can't, copy and paste the entire form. There's a huge amount of gray area in programming where it's very difficult to set expectations as far as what's okay and what isn't. And since things are so similar, people don't know what they're allowed to do, what they aren't allowed to do. So for example, I would say, you need to write your own code. It's okay if you use ideas from the internet. So I'd have people go on and type how to create a to-do app. And they'd follow some tutorial and they'd create the tutorial that was suggested online and handed it. And I'd be like, this doesn't look like anything what I was expecting. And they'd say, well, you told me to create my own code. So I went in and looked for how to create a to-do list and I created my own code and that follows all the rules. And it's like, well, it doesn't really follow the rules, but it's such a gray area in development that it's tough to set expectations. So with things like that, we have to be very careful to set clear expectations about what is considered cheating, what isn't considered cheating. And that goes for anything. You need to set an expectation as far as what you expect from your app. So I tell you to make a to-do list with a certain number of fields. Each of those fields are handled in a certain way with a specific type of validation. I go completely over the top and give you all of the details about how your form is laid out. But that's not necessarily the greatest idea either, because now instead of having people think for themselves, we're telling them how to complete the task at hand, and we're not letting them figure out why. We're not letting them figure out the process behind it. So I can tell somebody that you format a phone number using a regular expression, but we don't explain why, and we don't explain how it works. So we need to be careful not to encourage people to do things because that's the way it's done in this industry. We see it a lot. There are a lot of best practices and things that are kind of just, they happen because they happen. Everybody knows that A certain piece of code is written this way, but nobody really necessarily knows why, and not everybody takes the time to understand it. So it's very important to make sure that you're not just teaching people how things are done, but you're teaching them why it's done, and you're teaching them how to understand it, not just what the thing is. So, another issue, for example, I tried to play nice guy, and I thought, people don't like a whole lot of homework, so other than what's marked, I won't give people homework. And I also hate when I hear the same thing 100 times over because, I've already learned this and I don't need to hear it 10 times. So I didn't over-explain things, and I moved through the code kind of quickly. And I found out that I was horribly wrong, and I had made some bad assumptions about what people really were looking for. I was getting emails asking for more homework and more example problems and more demos, and to go over things that I had thought I'd went over dozens of times. And to do that, I needed feedback from students. And I had to be adaptable to that feedback. What I thought was going to work for students definitely wasn't what actually worked for students, because not everybody learns in the same way, and what works for me might not work for somebody else. So through feedback, which I asked my students for anytime they wrote a test or anything like that, I found out that maybe my methods weren't what worked for a lot of people. I was doing a lot of lecturing because that's what the previous professor had done, and that's what they'd left me. And I found out that that didn't work for a lot of people. And a lot of people just didn't understand, and they weren't learning from it. So it's important not to take it personally if something doesn't work for somebody. There's only so much you can do to make somebody understand, and ultimately, if they don't understand, it's up to them to reach out to you to find a new way. Skipping totally ahead here. So in the same sort of idea, while I had assumed that my students wanted more freedom, they also wanted stricter guidelines, which to me, as a more experienced developer, is not something that I want. I don't necessarily want strict guidelines. I want a little bit of freedom in what I do. But that's overwhelming, and I found a lot of people were really confused by what they were doing. So a lot of people were looking for things like opportunities for self-learning and guided research. They didn't want to just be thrown into the world of the internet with no way to find what they want, because a new developer doesn't have that experience to be able to pick out the good information and recognize what's going to work from the bad information. In the same kind of idea, how does a new person recognize quality? So I can tell you to look up the best way to complete a problem, but if you have no basis for taking those answers critically, then you're not going to be able to pick out what the best answer is, and you're just blindly going in and trying to pick something out at random and kind of hope that it works. So it's extremely difficult to teach people how to do that research without just answering a yes or no question. In order to do that, you need to create a more sensible progression of topics. So that means not just saying, find this end point or write me a to-do list. That means creating sensible steps along the way that a developer can follow to break a problem down into small pieces so that it's manageable. They have a specific progression, and they're not out there in the open. As developers, we use Google for pretty much everything 150 times a day. A lot of us don't bother to remember certain things because we know we can look them up, and we can look up what the parameters of a function are. And we can look up all of those different things. However, in order to do that, we also need to know what we're looking up. We need to know the process behind building something. If we Google how to write a to-do app, it's not going to tell us how to structure a to-do app. But if we Google how to format a phone number, Google can tell us that. So while I encourage my students to use Google and use the internet and use textbooks, I found that it wasn't very helpful because they had no basis for what they were looking for. And if you don't know what you're looking for, it's very difficult to find the answer. So I also learned that you're going to make a lot of mistakes along the way. Just like anything, and as a new developer, it's hard to accept that you're going to make a lot of mistakes while you write code. As a professor, I learned that I don't have to claim to know all of the answers. When I was going through school, my professors seemed like they were smart people and they were experts and they seemed to know everything about anything that was asked of them. But that's not necessarily a requirement. And as developers, it's not a requirement that we know everything. But it is a requirement that we know how to find the answer. So it's important to reinforce that idea that people don't necessarily have to know everything. So I kind of use this to my advantage. So say I was doing a lecture and I didn't know the answer to something. Or I was doing a demo and I made a mistake and my code didn't work and I couldn't figure out why. I turned this into a learning opportunity. That let me demonstrate not just what the answer was and how to write perfect code on the first try, but how to actually go and find the answer and pick out what the good information is and implement that into your project. So, it's frustrating when you get up there and you type out a demo that you've been working on and you get an error and you have no idea what the issue is. But that gives you an opportunity to say, well, let's start the debugging process. Let's look through the code and make sure there are no errors. And if we find the error on this line, well, we can look it up on the internet and use specific resources to find the answer. And once we find the answer, we can edit our code in such a way that it works. That's a normal part of the programming process, and we have to accept that we're going to make mistakes and we're going to spend time looking for bugs and trying to figure out solutions. And we can't just give up and consider it a fail if 30 seconds in Google hasn't told us the all-knowing answer of how to solve our problems. Sorry. So you need to use those mistakes as a learning opportunity to show that how to find the answers to your problems. So while my goal in the end as a professor, obviously, was to teach a new group of students, I found that I learned a lot from the experience as well. Not just some of the skills I talked about, like making mistakes and that sort of thing, but I learned about code myself in a lot more in-depth way than I ever imagined. So I went through school for almost the same thing as I'm teaching now, a little bit of a variation. And I found that all of that schooling didn't teach me half of what I learned from one semester of teaching. And that's a lot of that is because I discovered how I learn. So when I first got the course from the previous professor, when you start teaching, you get basically everything that was uploaded in the previous year. I had made the assumption that the professor before me knew what they were talking about, and that they knew what was best and how the students in the class learned. For me, that included a lot of technical lectures and terminology and a lot of projects with a lot of freedom. So I got these lectures full of technical information that were already written for me. And I was like, great, this is awesome. I don't have to write any lectures at all. I can just give them a read and go into class and I'm done. And that's the whole thing. It was absolutely miserable, and I hated it. And I spent far more time than I would ever spend trying to create that information in my own way. So when I was given something that was extremely technical, that jumped right into some high-level kind of ideas and big words that, that kind of stuff, I spent a lot of time trying to understand what was being given to me and try to research it so that I could share that with other people. So a lot of times I'd be in class and I'd be like, I have no idea what any of this is. And I'd be sitting there like flicking through my notes being like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. That confused the hell out of me. It confused my students. It took way too much time. So I decided to be adaptable and change my process in a way that worked for more people. So I decided to take the old lectures and glance over them for their ideas, and then completely scrap them and delete them off the face of the planet. And I took those ideas and I built them into a more logical step-by-step progression in a way that not only made sense for a new programmer, but that made sense for me. It's pretty difficult to teach something if you don't understand it and try to explain why a concept works if you have no idea what's happening. And I realized that I was doing exactly what I was trying to avoid teaching, and I was just jumping right into the end product of this works without understanding why it worked. So when I went to school, I learned code a lot different than what I teach. So I mainly learned C++, Java, and C#. And if you know a few languages, you know that those ideas are transferable between different languages. So once you know one, it's easier to learn a second one. And once you learn a second one, it's easier to learn a third. And eventually you can just skip back and forth between languages because you have a good idea of the similarities and what your end product is going to be. But when I'd done this, I'd ignored the beginner steps. And I knew that certain functions or certain processes could be used to get an end product. But I'd skipped all of the initial steps of learning why those things had worked. I never went in and figured out what all the different parameters meant. I just knew what I passed in to get it to work. And that goes for the workplace as well. You're working on somebody else's code, and you get your team's always done something a certain way, so you just keep doing it that way because that's how your team does it. So yeah, I was doing exactly what I was trying to avoid, and I realized that I'd only really memorized PHP and never really taken the time to fully understand it. I maybe understood other languages, but I'd never taken PHP down to the base level and gotten a thorough understanding of what it actually was. So I took a step back, and I basically made myself into a PHP 101 student. And anytime I taught something new, I broke it down into the absolute smallest pieces that I could and learned as much about it as I could. So that involves things like, for example, connecting to a database. I know that this is the connection string I use. But I'd never taken the time to maybe sit down and figure out what all the different parameters are and the different things that you can do with that and different ways that you can use it. I put a lot more focus into the basics. And once I figured out that maybe this isn't the only way to connect to a database, you can do 3 other things, it opened up a lot of new possibilities for me. I learned that along the way, I'd been doing things that maybe could have been done in a much better way. I I discovered new functions that maybe I had ignored. So maybe I had been completing a huge string of things for a task instead of one new function that I'd kind of missed along the way because I just jumped over that entire step. So I took the time to sort of learn all about all the different possibilities. I went back and I looked at my code and I realized that I was doing a lot of things that were kind of silly. And I turned my style of learning into lessons for my students. So not just throwing them into the deep end of here's how things work, but I took my logical steps of how I learned how a function works and turned that into a lesson for them. I led them along the way of figuring out the individual basics of the language. So immediately I noticed that my class was a lot more interested in what I was teaching. Instead of just memorizing a bunch of technical junk that they really didn't understand, I was giving them a logical path to learn those things on their own. So I let them discover those things for themselves and create a real understanding of how things worked. And immediately, my first semester, I had mentioned, went absolutely terribly. How are we doing for time? And honestly, my attendance was terrible. The people who did come didn't pay attention. I had nobody in the class. Once I changed and adapted to my students and made a course that made more sense for me so that I could understand it and teach it better, my attendance went up, the understanding went up. The products that came back from the class went way up in quality because I was actually getting back what I expected to get back and giving them a way to find the quality answers that they needed to complete the task. So I came out with a far more thorough understanding of why I wrote some of the code that I wrote all along. I came out with a lot of new ideas about how I wanted to write things and how I wanted to combine things and create some new features that I had never even known were possibilities. And I came out with far less assumptions. So when I received something from a client, I didn't assume that they wanted something in a specific way. I made sure to share with them what my expectations were and have them share with me what their expectations were. And everything became a lot more fluid and a less rocky road along the way, I guess would be the way to say it. So I didn't learn like my previous professor did with technical information. But my whole class doesn't learn like me either. So you have to take the time to get feedback from your class because maybe some people do learn in the same way that you do. Other people might learn in a completely different way. And once I took that feedback into account, I was able to speak effectively to a lot more people in a way that they would understand. So you have to accept that you can't plan for everything. You can't know how every person learns. You can't force every person to learn either. So you can't take it personally if somebody fails their test even though they came to every class. And that's difficult as a professor to know that you tried to create something that would make sense and be engaging for everybody, and not everybody could get it. But that's something that you have to accept, that not every person is going to understand what you're trying to teach them, and that maybe programming isn't for every person out there either. You have to accept that you will make mistakes along the way and you can't be perfect. You're probably going to make a fool of yourself at least once by making some monumental, avoidable mistake. You're probably going to forget what you're talking about at least once, like I've done 3 times during this lecture. And you have to stop and be like, I have no idea what I was talking about. Like I heard happen earlier, you have to accept that equipment's going to fail and you have to improvise along the way and hope that you can keep attention. And all of that is okay. You have to accept that not everything's going to be perfect. As a teacher, you can't make everything perfect for your students, And as a developer, not everything can be perfect with your clients or with your team. But you have to figure out how to work around those things and create a learning opportunity to avoid those issues in the future. So everything is a learning opportunity. It's important to start at the beginning, even though you can dive into a new piece of code or something like that, or a new technology. It's important to take the time to actually understand what you're doing. And knowing the answers doesn't make us great developers, but knowing how to find the solutions and find the way is what makes you a great developer. Cool. All right. Well, thank you for paying attention.